Hi everybody. So as I just said, my name is Dr. Bob Nicholson. I'm a senior lecturer in history at Edgehill University. Edgehill, just the question I was going to ask, is a small university in Ormskirk, just north of Liverpool. I focus on the history of Victorian popular culture. A particular interest in transatlantic relations, in history of periodicals. But lately, I've become interested in an aspect of Victorian life that, well, I guess, is popularly supposed not to exist, which is a sense of humour. And it's at this point in my talk, I always kind of have to start with this. I have to start with a warning. I've realised this now, having talked about this a lot, that in a few minutes I'm going to start telling you Victorian jokes. I kind of don't want you to worry, but it does create a slightly odd atmosphere, because, I mean, they're not funny. I'm going to tell you something. And I've done some various radio interviews and conference presentations about this, and there is a weird tension in the room when somebody tells a joke and nobody laughs. And it can kind of make the whole thing feel very, very awkward. So I just want to reassure you, you don't have to laugh at them. We're going to look at them as scholars in a very, very serious way. So don't worry, we'll press on. But this is all, I suppose, keying into an assumption we have about the Victorians, right? That they are somehow dour, joyless, completely incapable of smiling or laughing or telling a joke. I mean, the most famous quote attributed to Queen Victoria, largely is supposedly, "We are not amused." And this idea that the Victorians are completely devoid of humour, it's pervasive. It's one of the things that people are most frequent to say about the Victorians, are very stiff on their very straight laced. And I don't think it's very fair. Lately, I've been kind of trying to dig into this assumption and start to maybe think, well, actually, Victorians must have laughed. They must have had a sense of humour. And if they did, well, then how can we start to recover it? And the surprising thing is not so much that it exists, but that actually Victorian jokes and Victorian humour, when you start looking for them, are everywhere. So I found them now, in the course of the last few years of research, I found Victorian joke books that were very popular Christmas presents. There were periodicals devoted entirely to humour, punishment, humour. But most interestingly, the thing that I've really become focused on is that the most popular newspapers in Victorian Britain printed regular joke columns. Every week you would get a column of 20 or 30 jokes. These run for sometimes 30 years at a time every week. If you start doing the numbers, we're talking hundreds of thousands of jokes that are being published in the most popular form of print culture at the time. So to suggest that the Victorians were somehow humorless, I mean, the jokes might not be great, but they are talented nevertheless. And so as a historian, I become increasingly interested in thinking about, well, how can I start to explore these jokes? How can I recover them? And what might I do with them as a researcher? From an academic point of view, I think their use is obvious. I mean, there is an assumption sometimes to treat this kind of ephemeral popular culture as being less important than Dickens or Oscar Wilde or those kind of great literary sort of figures of the literary canon. For me, this kind of popular humour, though, as a researcher, is incredibly interesting and important. You know, the things that we laugh at, the people we laugh at, the situations in which we laugh, all of these things reveal something about our society. And I think, in particular, they reveal often the kind of hidden assumptions about that society. If you think about a joke, usually it involves either recognising something universal that we all kind of recognise, a kind of behaviour or character trait, or it's about subverting an assumption, something surprising happens. And so within each of these jokes, sometimes only a line long, there are all sorts of cultural assumptions and practices that are embedded. When you kind of have 500,000 of these jokes, you have a seriously large amount of what to look at. So for a cultural historian, I think they're incredibly interesting. And they also have a contemporary significance, as I've sort of looked at in my other work. An enormous number, for example, of American jokes are reported into Victorian Britain. You know, every week there will be a column of American jokes in these papers. So half a century before Hollywood, forms of American pop culture were being reported and circulated. And I think it's a really interesting way in which the Victorians encountered America. So I'm very interested in these from a very sort of academic research point of view. But what I've started thinking about recently, I suppose, is how I should go about researching. What's the most effective way to explore these kind of sources? And for now, I've been using the conventional newspaper archives with which many people will be familiar. So I've identified particular recurring joke columns. This is Jokes of the Day in the Wales Weekly newspaper. And I can search for that, I can read over it. And up to a point, this is fine. You know, we can identify jokes this way, we can explore them. But this archive was never designed to explore this kind of source. This is a universal archive designed to explore every kind of newspaper genre, based around a very simple kind of keyword searching. You know, you find the right word, you find the associated geography. But if we want to explore jokes as a researcher, you know, there are all sorts of other things we might be interested about, let's say, searching for particular genres, particular character types, locations, identifying speech, you know, to know, how do I search for a joke about lawyers if the word lawyer isn't used, if it's, you know, the context comes from another kind of word. And so that's the kind of thing I became interested in, is how could I maybe extract these jokes from this existing archive, reformulate them into a new archive that was built for them, a bespoke archive designed for this kind of research. And that was, I suppose, the position in which I started thinking about getting in touch with the British Library and about applying for the Labs competition, because clearly this involved working with some big data collections, which I didn't necessarily have the right kind of access to. So my initial idea, the one I was kind of working with when I applied, was that I wanted to create an online archive of Victorian jokes. But as I was writing the application, I did start to think, well, maybe that's not interesting enough. Maybe it's actually just creating a database isn't necessarily going to be that creative, that eye-catching. And so I started to think about also, I suppose we're all being encouraged to think about impact now, right? I started to think about, well, actually, if I build this database, how could I start to show it to people? How could I start to circulate these jokes? In my own research, I'm really interested in, I guess, the 19th century version of going viral. You know, when a joke kind of starts getting reprinted in every newspaper, travels the world. And I tracked one joke as it kind of did that journey. And so I started to think, well, actually, could we reintroduce Victorian jokes, these terrible gags, into the bloodstream of modern comedy? And how might we go about doing that? And so those were the two kind of projects I started with. Build a serious research archive, but also playfully think about how we might produce into audiences. And so this is the idea that I pitched to the British Library. As Mahendra said, you can read about this online. You know, there is the kind of full text of my application on the website. This is what I suggested. And the first thing I wanted to do was to find a way to extract jokes from newspapers. In other words, to pick out these particular fragments within the newspaper and to then combine them into a new archive. What I then wanted to do was to think about ways that we might annotate jokes, add additional metadata. So here, for example, we have a joke which a woman from Chicago the woman says, "How much do you charge for a divorce?" Which the lawyer replies, $100, ma'am, or 6 for $500. Now for that we might annotate the fact that it's an American joke, that it's about a lawyer, that it's in Chicago. Now this is where it gets a little bit weird. Once people had annotated those jokes, that's I suppose the research side of it, and then we have a useful archive. What I wanted to do though was to try and find a way to take the information from that joke, the annotations, and find a way to match it with one of the British Library's images from one of its digital collections. Now once that image has been found, in this case you can see so the joke involved a woman talking to a man or a lawyer. Here we have an image where a woman seems to be talking to some kind of businessman. The idea is we would develop a way to take that joke and to, I suppose, automatically superimpose it onto the image and create a kind of cartoon or meme representation of it, which would look something, I guess. So here we have, as I say, Chicago woman doing a little joke. This is a kind of literal interpretation of the joke, which is now in a format where it can be shared on Twitter. You know, we don't have to worry about character limits. The image is, the meme is a kind of unit of online comedy, right? It can go anywhere, it can circulate across all the social networks. And so I thought, okay, well, that'd be interesting. Doesn't necessarily make the joke any funnier. Then I started thinking, well, actually, what if we paired it with slightly more unusual images? So in this case, what if the woman and the lawyer were in an office but were watching something slightly more interesting and embraced? The joke is now different. We've reinvented it, we've reinterpreted it. The humour is now something new. What if the lawyer was instead hanging from a rope as the wife's husband chopped it off? You know, there are all sorts of different ways you could interpret this. Or what if we just completely decided, well, forget about trying to make a logical connection between the joke and the image. What if the woman was a bear and the lawyer was Nick Morgan? And again, what I've learned, I think, is the weirder the better with these things. That actually bizarre combinations of jokes with characters who shouldn't be telling a joke in that situation actually turns out to be the stuff that people seem to enjoy the most. So that was, I suppose, the idea, that these would then be sent out over Twitter, and we would kind of keep track of retweets about how they would kind of work. And we'd kind of get a sense of maybe what was funny and what wasn't. So that's the idea I pitched. To extract the jokes, create an archive, and find an interesting way of sending them out as images. So this is what we managed to do. And I think it's fair to say that what I was proposing there is actually probably more like a 3-year project that requires about 500,000 characters. And so actually, 4 months, I'm not a developer, I understand digital humanities, but I can't build any of this myself. So I was essentially relying on Ben at the British Library Labs to do this himself on the volumes of the project in 4 months. And clearly, we weren't going to produce that kind of level of archive. But what we have managed to do is to start to explore all of those different processes, to make progress on some, to recognise the roadblocks with others. And I'm just going to quickly kind of go through those now and give you an insight into what we have managed to do. I think more importantly, what we haven't managed to do. Because if you're thinking of applying for the competition, or indeed using this kind of data, newspaper data, there are some unexpected roadblocks, some problems that I didn't expect to encounter, and that we haven't necessarily overcome yet, but are worth learning about. So the first thing that we had to figure out how to do was to find the jokes. We're talking here about an archive with 70 different newspapers, often being published in tens of millions of pages. How do we find the jokes? Well, actually, our first kind of port of call was actually think, well, newspapers are hard, why don't we just find a joke? And we found a book in the library's 19th century books collections, which is entirely filled with jokes, although actually, bits of wit and wisdom too, which aren't that funny. But if you flip through it, you can see it's really nicely formatted. The jokes are separated out there, their own titles. From a point of view kind of automating this and extracting things, there's not much messy data to pick around. It's a useful way to start. And so we had one of our volunteers at the British Library basically taking the OCR text from this and separating it out into individual jokes, which is still quite a lot of work, but it's been successful. So that's the kind of thing that looks like. But because I'm a newspaper historian, and because this is where we were going to get a lot of jokes, I have this aim to get to a mythical 1 million Victorian jokes kind of thing. If we wanted to do that, we had to use a newspaper. This is where everything was. And this is where things got a bit more tricky. You can see that they do have these titles, that they are branded. They're not, well, a lot of jokes are scattered around in the newspaper as column fillers here, there, and everywhere. They're very difficult to find. If you get it in a dedicated column where you know, I'm going to get 30 jokes if I find this column, that seems like a kind of possibility. And so the question is, how do you find it? Before I applied, I kind of thought a bit about this, and I managed to get a look at some of the XML behind some of Gale's newspaper archives. Gale was designed in 19th century newspapers. And you can see there is this field associated with, in the XML, title. So Gale have already processed newspapers, split them up into individual articles, and given those articles a particular field which actually corresponds to that title. So if I had the title jokes of the day, theoretically at least, I thought I would be able to identify all items within the archive that have that field, that title in the XML, and then extract them. And this, I suppose, is where things got a bit unexpectedly difficult. In my animation, where that nice little pipe that sucks things out, I thought that'd be easy. Within the first few days, we'll have done this. The actual truth is that we still haven't necessarily managed to find a way to do this. And the problem comes, I suppose, because the archive we're using was never designed for this. When it was designed to be explored through this interface, a very straightforward interface aimed at general researchers. And they didn't build an API that allows you to connect to this to extract things on your own terms. The data is also stored in the British Library in a format where pretty much nobody can access it, or at least not in a kind of useful format. This reaches a point where it's almost the equivalent of digging a hole in the ground and burying it, rather than putting it in an accessible format. So we were faced with a problem. I mean, in some respects, the most useful and interesting part of this project was how do we extract specific content from newspapers. I'm really keen to push that. I really want to find out how to do that. We can do it with jokes, we can do it with sports reports, with recipe columns, with serialized fiction. We can create new archives from so many different forms of content. But in that formal period, we were left with a choice. Do we want to really spend ages dealing with the internal politics, with the copyright issues, with simply the technical problems of even accessing this data in a useful way? Or were we going to park that and push on to the other side of the project? In the end, we decided that the most useful thing to do would be to manually download a small set of columns rather than a million jokes, we're trying to get 1,000. And then we push on with the other side of things to try and figure out how else we might push the project forward. And that's what we ended up doing. And in some respects, we were always going to have to do this, this kind of fully automated process of just sort of saying, extract those thousands of columns and turn them into a new archive, was always going to have problems. And the problems, of course, come from OCR. We're all familiar with the problems with article recognition and its accuracy. So here I have a joke on the left from a newspaper, which Mrs. Talbot says, I've seen by the paper made that Mrs. Foley is still dangerously ill, but insists upon having 2 wings added to her house before she dies. Talbot replies, good idea, Mark, judging from all reports that the only pair of wings she will ever have. Which you quite like, it's kind of nice, it's cutting joke. But you look at the OCR on the right, it's not perfect, it's not terrible, but there are problems there. And if we were going to find a fully automated way of, let's say, republishing that as an image, if you hadn't got that one on the left, and I just sent that out on Twitter, it would make no sense whatsoever. So we need some kind of human intervention here to correct the OCR. We were always going to have to do that. So actually, that fully automated process was going to run into another roadblock down the line anyway. So this is what we started to do. Ben, the British Library Labs developer, helped set up a really quick transcription and sort of archiving platform. Within the space of a couple of days, using existing tools, it allowed us to get it in very quickly. He used Omeka, the content management system, which is used by Creative Archives, and a plugin called Script. What I would basically do is I would upload a scannable joke column. I'll show you what it looks like into this window here. My volunteers, who I kind of strung out a group of students from my university to help me, would pick a column, and then they would transcribe it in a kind of transcription window down here. We came up with a really basic way of tagging these jokes in a formatting that would allow us to capture the core information from the column. So for sake of argument, here's a joke, contacted over a business, in which Joe says, I always make a point of telling my wife everything that happens. His friend Brian replies, my dear fellow, I tell my wife lots of things that never happen. Now, I show you this because it's a nice short joke, and also because it captures the structure of how these jokes are presented in the column. You have a title, usually capital letters at the start, you have the joke text, and then you have an attribution here. So this joke was stolen from a newspaper there. Joke piracy was rampant in the 19th century. It's quite rare that they would actually tell you where they stole it from. So one of the things that we had to figure out is when we started this project, I didn't have permission to take these scans in a commercial digital archive and just send them out to whoever wanted. I had to find a way to be like, text, the content is not copyrighted, but it's scanning. So I had to find a way to liberate the joke from the scan. The core information from this then was the fact that it has a title, joke, and an attribution. If we capture that, we no longer need the original scan necessarily to capture anything about the meaning of the joke. So we came up with a really basic way of formatting it. So a J tag that indicates the start and end of an individual joke. My students had to transcribe a column at a time, 30 at a time, so we had to find a way to separate them out. There was a sort of title field with the T, and then an attribution field with the A. And then that gives us the information to kind of play around with formatting afterwards. Very basic, nothing particularly complicated about it. But it doesn't now mean I don't need that in for to actually use the joke. After that, we haven't started doing this yet, we would then start thinking about ways to tag additional features like names, dialogue. You think it from a research point of view, if you can immediately identify passages of dialogue from a linguistic point of view, from somebody interested in course linguistics, that'd be really interesting to be able to separate out different sections of text. Or about identifying names, locations, are there recurring characters in these jokes that we wouldn't notice without the kind of ability to link them together. So this is, I suppose, where I see things developing, but not necessarily with that language. So that was the kind of the process of transcribing them, of annotating them. Very basic. We haven't built a kind of bespoke transcription annotation system here. We're working with a kind of quick, dirty system that we could get it really quickly and just get on with it and start something like this. The next thing then that we started thinking about was, okay, we've got an archive now, we have a database of these jokes, about 1,500 transcribed jokes, a very small set of the jokes. The next thing to think about was how can we publish them. And you remember the ones I showed you at the start were kind of images from Victorian newspapers with speech bubbles attached. That would be great, and that kind of is the most effective way of doing this, of kind of linking a character to a bit of a speech, but it's incredibly difficult. If you're going to try and automate this, where do the speech bubbles go? Are they going to line up with faces? What if the character speaks twice in the scene? What if they also speak an incredibly long speech? How does that kind of fit? And so we couldn't necessarily start with that process. We had to start with something that's simpler. And this is the format that we've come up with. It's kind of basic. It's based on a kind of vertical sort of column where you have a joke at the top. You can see the title field there, and then the main kind of joke there. That feeds into randomly linked images. I've got about 50 of these in the system now, taken from the British Library. I kind of drew these speech bubbles on. So that image actually contains a little bit of red at the bottom and a little bit of gold at the top. So it will fit with any joke. It kind of automatically designed to do. And then we have all of the kind of metadata at the bottom, where does it come from, when was it published. So you can kind of see the history of it. And you can see the kind of variations on this that can kind of adjust depending on the size of the joke. There is no connection at all between the content of the image and the joke. It's completely random at this stage. And that kind of leads to sometimes very weird and confusing situations, like this monkey giving kind of philosophical advice to a guy who seems to be terrified of it. Occasionally, it kind of leads to others. This is from the British Library's Flickr collections. This was from an actual joke, so these images were designed for a joke telling. It's been an interesting kind of exposure to see how that worked. But as I said, some of the things that happen with these random pairings is that occasionally the jokes take on a new and kind of weird vibe. So here we have a sea monster being shot at by people in a boat saying, put this restriction on your pleasures, be cautious that they injure no being which has life. So it kind of creates this bizarre situation where this sort of philosophical sea monster is pleading to people in a boat, which I kind of like. There's this one here where a man is eaten by a crocodile and his wife and his sister is shouting, the firmest friendships have been formed in mutual adversity. And it takes what is actually a piece of sort of wisdom, not funny, into kind of weird. So that's what we kind of do. What do we do with them? Well, we send them out over Twitter, and this is the point at which I encourage you to take out your phones and start following the mechanical comedian. If you go to Victorian Humour on Twitter, you'll see we have this kind of setup. We haven't fully automated this yet. Basically, at lunchtime every day, I go through and pick one out from my archive and automatically tweet it out. And it gets automatically posted to Twitter and to Tumblr. And in fact, I'll show you a quick example of this. Oh, yes, sorry, that's it's kind of that one. Okay, so let me just show you quickly what we've actually got. So the first thing to know, we have a joke database that you can flip through. This is kind of, it's not designed for public consumption, but victorianhumour.com, you can flip through all the jokes we've got at the moment. We then have this editing field. So I've got one example up here, not necessarily a particularly good joke. One of the things you'll notice is the OCR has kind of garbled the text a bit. It's missed out a lot of the spaces. So we have a little editing thing. Okay, so I'll just fix this one. Put some spaces in. So I say Jack shouted a Smithfield drover to his companion. These sheep. Now this is an interesting one. I think this is meant to be an accent. These sheep evolved rather than one person to keep that. Lenders, I think that's meant to be a bark. Lenders, the bark of your dog. So we submit the changes. It's been updated. Here we can see it's fixed in formatting as I do. We can publish it to Tumblr and then publish it to Twitter. So hopefully, if we know. Oh, no. That's the first time it's ever not worked.
It's a joke.
I think the mechanical comedian might have collapsed. Alright, okay, well, I'll have to be in touch with Ben about this. You direct your questions to Ben about why that doesn't work. But you can see what happens on Twitter is that we have a set of stereotypical comedic openings, like, have you ever heard the one about, or, I say. So it randomly picks one of those, and then you can kind of see it here on Twitter. So by all means, follow the mechanical comedian when he starts tweeting again. I'm not sure what's happened to him. But we can do that. So on Tumblr, we kind of have the same thing. But we also have a discussion plugin at the bottom. So at some point, as we kind of expand the archive and expand this process, we might start doing 1 an hour. There will be lots of jokes which don't make any sense, which we look at as modern